This event and the report that I encourage you to read, share, tweet about, etc., is the result of the fact that we actually had way more data on these individuals. So what started off essentially as a crime-terror nexus project, it grew into something way bigger, and I think today it's a reflection of that. So we're not only discussing the final results of the project, that will be the last panel, during which we will hear from the representatives of the, let's say, biggest net contributors. It's not the ones who worked the hardest, although they work very hard, but it's the ones who actually gave us the most cases of those jihadis in our sample. Our sample is 326 jihadis from 2015, so the peak year of European jihadism, and we do sincerely hope that this will stay the peak year, so there's nothing worse is coming, hopefully. I know it sounds a bit horrible promo-wise, but that's the reality. So that will be the last panel kind of discussing our results. But in the meantime, there are certain issues that we wanted to pick up in the discussion, and that's the issue of prison radicalization. Many people talk about prison radicalization, and we feel quite only a few know what actually it entails. Thankfully, we have Thomas Renard from Egmont here in Brussels to lead the discussion, and we have some distinguished speakers whom he will introduce. Secondly, we have a panel on what we would call radical mosques. When we looked at our research, it still seems that 18 years after 9/11 and the Hamburg and the mosque there, it's still a discussion. These mosques still are a place for these individuals to congregate, to exchange info, to exchange intel, and then go on to do, inverted commas, big things. We do have a panel. This one's going to be led by Roderick Parks of the EU ISS, and he's going to be introducing the speakers who are there. But without further ado, let me now introduce our opening speaker, Geoffrey Van Orden, who is the MEP. He's the leader of the Conservatives at the European Parliament. And he has a magnificent track record of work in security and defense, more than 30 years of service in the military intelligence, with, of course, the service in Northern Ireland. He was also the chief of staff of the British sector in Berlin in 1989. He worked at NATO. That was his last, let's say, deployment, if I can put it this way. But he also worked with the European Commission, so a practitioner in a true sense, a speaker, and a spokesman for many committees related to defense and security and essentially terrorism as well. Let me not name them so that Geoffrey can join us quicker. I think the right man to kick us off today, Geoffrey, if you could please, if you could join us here and then give us your take. So welcome, and let's hear from you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Milan. After that introduction, I can't wait to hear what I've got to say. Well done to GLOBSEC for organising this conference. I have to say that the news agenda has a very short shelf life. We haven't had a major Islamist terrorist attack since December last year. The Christmas market in Strasbourg, if you remember, when 5 people were murdered. There have, of course, been some recent attacks, mainly of far-right sort of origin, but the Islamist ones, it's a little while since we've had it. So we're in danger of becoming complacent. So I very much welcome conferences such as this, which remind us of the continuing threat of terrorism. I'm afraid a lot of people are very naive about terrorism. Or they seek to apologize for or justify the terrorists and their actions. They have obviously never witnessed at first hand the terrible consequences of a terrorist attack, in particular on those who receive devastating, life-changing injuries, and on the families of the victims. You sometimes hear the tired cliche that one person's terrorist is another's freedom fighter. This is, in my view, casuistry. It's, in my lifetime, I can't think of a single terrorist organization that has delivered freedom. Terrorism is about control, about political power. Disgracefully, some have suggested that Brexit may compromise the so-called Good Friday Agreement relating to Northern Ireland. In saying this, they provide an excuse, if not legitimacy, to IRA offshoots which have never gone away. over the past 20 years, there's been a steady drumbeat of intimidation and low-level violence, with the thugs competing for control of certain areas. This year there have been shootings and bomb incidents staged by the so-called Continuity IRA or New IRA, and yesterday even there was a mob on the streets in the Craigan area of Londonderry after the police disarmed a car bomb. And by the way, we even have a convicted IRA terrorist, an MEP in the European Parliament. The political dilemma is that at some stage you're probably going to have to talk to terrorist groups. But obviously in doing so, you give legitimacy to them. And that's the real problem, I think, for the politicians. No wonder people are confused. In Northern Ireland, we have a situation where there seems to be some sort of acceptance now of a sort of moral equivalence between IRA terrorist murderers on the one hand and soldiers and police trying to do their duty on the other. Scores of British military personnel are under investigation in response to allegations about events 40 or more years ago. As you'll understand, this is purely for political reasons. Meanwhile, I would say that counter-terrorist operations have been systematically delegitimized and hamstrung over the years. Every time there is a successful weapon against the terrorists, it's now put into the public arena and scrutinized with the effort to disable it. I think of interrogation techniques. I think of the use of informers and agents. I think of access to communications. Our security and intelligence services that were once out of the public gaze are now treated as fair game. In recent years, most, but clearly not all, terrorism has been Islamist. And since the 1980s, Islamist-inspired terrorism has become the main threat to the security of the Western liberal democracies. I would say that in the medium to long term, the greatest threat to our security comes from the nexus of jihadist terrorism and weapons of mass destruction. A great effort on the part of terrorist groups to get their hands on a suitable weapon. But of course the most immediate threat is from ad hoc attacks. We know from 22,000 ISIS recruitment records, plus analysis of ISIS attackers, that a criminal past, conversion to radical Islam, and social connections to entrepreneurs of violence are the key issues in terms of recruitment. A crisis of identity and access to violent ideology, typically on social media, help to spur the disaffected on. And I have to say also, unbelievably, at this time there is little control across Europe of huge numbers of people entering our countries from the very places that spawn the most radical and extreme ideas hostile to our way of life. Whereas migrants often seek to escape the cultural, social and political constraints of their previous life, too often they find themselves under the same influences waiting for them in the new host country. But it'd be wrong to assume that the threat mainly comes from the fresh outsider. As we've seen in recent terrorist incidents, the perpetrator is usually homegrown. The Henry Jackson Society, a couple of years ago, analysed some 264 convictions for Islamist-inspired terrorist offences in the United Kingdom over the previous 20 years. And they came to certain conclusions about that. Most were committed by men, although female involvement has recently increased. The mean terrorist age was about 27. Some 72% were British nationals, but nearly half of them were born in the UK, but most had South Asian ancestry. They were likely to come from areas of higher than average Muslim density in our own country, and most came from a very small number of places. In fact, in London, I think there were 3 particular boroughs that were most spawned the most terrorists. There was little correlation between involvement in terrorism and educational or employment status. 16% of attacks were committed by converts, including 5 who'd been converted while in prison for other reasons, and I know you will talk more about that in the course of today. Over half were living at home, either with a partner or with parents. 76% were previously known to the authorities, often for low-level criminal activities, and I know that's something also you'll be focusing very much on today. So, ladies and gentlemen, there were just a few thoughts there. Finally, may I mention that the United Kingdom is recognised as having among the most highly effective and professional security and intelligence services operating on a global basis. In the fight against terrorism, we require the closest liaison and operational collaboration between our police and security services and our continental counterparts. We have a long-established tradition of doing this on a bilateral and indeed a multilateral basis. I see absolutely no reason why that should not continue. Post-Brexit, I'm sure those bilateral arrangements will continue very effectively, and I feel sure also arrangements will be made for access to data and for a good relationship with EU institutions such as Europol. And I might say that the heads of all those institutions have made it very clear that that's exactly what they want in the future. So it's up to a few of the politicians over here to pull their fingers out and get this whole business sorted out in the right sort of way. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your attention.
Good morning, everyone. Indeed, we have a short panel, so I'll try to make it effective with those speakers, but I'm very glad to have a great lineup for discussing indeed what has become one of the big priorities of our politicians and of our security services here in Europe, which is the issue of terrorist convicts in prison and radicalization in prison more generally. We have with us 3 great speakers. We have, and I'm going to take some risk in pronouncing their names, I'm very sorry. We have with us Bart Skurman from Leiden University. He's also research director or coordinator at ICCT in The Hague, the famous counterterrorism think tank in The Hague. We have also Eleni Foto, who is a forensic psychologist based in Greece. She's done a lot of work in prisons in Greece. She's very familiar with that environment. And last but not least, we have with us Victor Schuch, who is junior fellow, a junior researcher at GLOBSEC. So perhaps my first question would go for you, Victor. How big is radicalization in prison a challenge in Europe? I mean, basically, are prisons full of terrorists or potential terrorists across Europe?
Thank you very much for the question, and thank you very much for inviting me. I'm one of the organizers, so I got the free seat, I guess. To answer your question, Tom, well, in our research, in the publication that we're trying to launch here, the result is quite interesting. Actually, it was interesting and shocking or surprising to us as well, because we only found 15 people out of, I think, 235 that were purely radicalized in prison. the way we got to this answer is we use a codebook, which is a questionnaire where we ask certain questions about certain individuals. And one of the questions was, what is the radicalizing factor? And we found only 15 people who were actually radicalized in prison. However, it's not as simple as that, because sometimes there is a combination of factors. So we can't take this number at its face value. And if I may start with a bit of a short story from Spain, we found, for instance, there was a violent individual who was imprisoned for the fact that he was shooting at the police squad or police officers. He went to prison and he wasn't radical before. However, he has met a person who's been in prison for precisely radicalizing at least 20 individuals in his past. I think he spent around 2 months' time with this person in prison, sharing the cell. And so he left the prison radicalized, but he also managed to radicalize his younger brothers. So this gave us an idea. Obviously, we need to be looking at more factors, and when we look at how many people were radicalized by family members and friends, the number jumps into 77. So already we have 15 people who were radicalized in prison and 77 who were radicalized by family and friends. So what I'm trying to say is there needs to be a more comprehensive look at the radicalization as such. But by prisons, I wouldn't like to exaggerate that it's an issue on the European level, but I'm also speaking only about the 2015 arrestees. So it's obviously you need to take this with a grain of salt.
I mean, what you were touching on is also quite interesting. I mean, there's a lot of talk about radicalization in prison, but it's not always clear what we're talking about. It's just like in the outside environment, radicalization can take different forms, can have different causes, can have different factors in play. And so basically, when we talk about radicalization in prison, what are we actually talking about, perhaps, Bart?
Yeah, it's a good question. So my colleagues and I have done quite a lot of work with the Dutch probation services who have a specialized reintegration program for people who are convicted or suspected of involvement in extremism and terrorism. And whether or not these people are radicalized further or radicalized at all in prison is certainly something that's on their radar. But what strikes me there actually, and maybe this is going on a bit of a tangent, that it isn't one of their primary concerns. They certainly see it, they take precautions against it, and maybe to address your question more directly, one of the things they're primarily worried about is that someone who is in a vulnerable position, just going into prison, will come into contact with people, of course, who are already radicalized, and they will be drawn into this worldview, maybe not just out of pure ideological conviction in the first place, but because they need someone to kind of hold on to, right? They need a social place to belong in this new and often frightening environment. So there's a couple of dimensions there. But that being said, it's the one thing I'd like to add, I think that goes also to Victor's point, that we have to be very careful not to generalize too much. So from what I understand, for instance, in France, it's quite a considerably larger problem than it would be, for instance, in the Netherlands, where some very specific precautions are made to separate, for instance, the most hardline individuals in prisons from those who are, relatively speaking, less radicalized, in an attempt to also keep them from influencing each other. So I'd be a bit cautious in this one.
I think I'd like to come back a little bit later in the discussion on what is being done to address this issue, but perhaps can I just push you a little bit to expand on what you see from your research and notably from this research project you've done with probation on what are sort of the factors that increase the risk of radicalization in prison, and in contrast, I think you've also done some work on the protective factors. I think it's also interesting and important to take into account not only the risk factors, but also the protective factors.
So I think one of the things that really stands out, and we can talk about prisons, we can talk about other social environments, is whether or not there are people there who are, let's say, charismatic authority figures, someone who's very able, someone's eloquent, who can convey these radical extreme points of views in a convincing fashion, or whether something like that is lacking. Whether let's say, the radical wing among the prisoners are having internal discussions about the right particular type of conviction to uphold, or whether they're very unified in what they see as their worldview, which makes it easier to convey it upon others. So So I think the particular social setting, again, that is at play here is a particularly important one.
Eleni, now I'm turning to you. You've done a lot of work in prison as well. So how do you see radicalization sort of unfolding in prison from your fieldwork?
I have to say that in Greece it's a different case altogether than the rest of Europe. I think it's similar to some extent to Spain and Italy because we do not have jihadi terrorism. We had 28 cases in 2015, which is one of the largest cases, but most of them were leftist terrorism and nihilist terrorism. So these are individuals that come from the society. They're younger people who have family ties, who have friends, who have these networks that are in existence, and they go to a prison that is mostly in the center of Athens. So it's very, very easy for people to come and visit them and establish networks from on the outside. Also, these individuals who have been convicted for terrorism, who have been arrested for terrorism, also belong to anarchist networks that are marginal. So it's relatively easy for them to make the transition from an ideologically nihilist environment to leftist terrorism. But they still need the expertise, let's say, of certain individuals that they can find in prison. So that's what we found, what happened. So we have some convicted terrorists, leftist terrorists, who went inside the prison and mingled with these hardened criminals who had a long career in thefts, and they made that connection. So that's our understanding, and also it's an interesting case in Greece because our convicted terrorists are very vocal about how they went about establishing these networks. They're not hiding it. They published books about it. They speak to the media about their activities. It's not something they hide, so we have a lot of information.
And I think the case of Greece and what you just highlighted is quite interesting and important in the sense that there is a tendency to focus on jihadi radicalization in general, but also jihadi radicalization in prison. I don't know, Victor, Bart, do you also think that there is an over-focus, exaggerate focus on jihadi radicalization? Do you think there are also other forms radicalization, of course, is something that, it's a term that many of us have a little bit of difficulties with, but to put ourselves in the narrative of this project, of also a hub of crime-terror nexus for other forms of terrorism. Victor, Bart?
Maybe perhaps I can speak. Since we're an NGO, we're always looking for funding and things like that. We're looking also for funding from the EU. And what we see are a lot of calls that are trying to combat or tackle the radicalization wholesomely, or whatever the adverb is there. I don't think they're just looking at the jihadi radicalization anymore. I think we're moving on to also, we're looking at right-wing radicalization. And perhaps that's maybe a bias from my region, but if we're talking about radicals in Central Europe, it's more to there's more people who are radicalized into the right-wing extremist groups rather than jihadi. So, but like I said, it's maybe just my bias.
But I mean, if I can just push you before Bart, you can say something. But so again, I do have the feeling, and perhaps this is my own bias by being a researcher on jihadi terrorism, but that we do spend a lot of efforts and resources on researching jihadi terrorism, whereas in Greece, you're dealing with left-wing terrorism. In many other countries, as you're saying, in Eastern Europe, with right-wing extremism. This is also something, of course, that is occurring in this part of Europe as well. So do you think that we are biased in our perception? And the question also, underlying question is, everything that we are trying to understand as researchers and making policy recommendations, does it also apply to these other forms of radicalization?
Well, that's something that's there to see. Obviously, I think there's overlaps and there's differences. I know it's a very diplomatic and vague answer in this respect. Obviously, I think when you talk about radicalization, we mostly talk about jihadi radicalization, but I think that sort of reflects the threat that we are currently facing. And perhaps the extreme right wing it's coming up, but it might not be there yet. I just mentioned that one because that's something that I see in my region. But I think you're right in saying that the jihadi one is the prevalent, and that's the focus.
Yeah, so on your last question, I think we can absolutely learn things from different ideological forms of terrorism. So whether someone is a jihadist or a right-wing extremist or an IRA member, there's going to be lots of commonalities in the ways in which people can become involved and maybe also exit from or even de-radicalize from terrorism. So I think there's certainly lots of benefits to considering the similarities. As to your first question about are we over-focused on jihadism as a radicalization in prisons, again, it depends on context. I think it's very good that we're having more attention for other forms of extremism, particularly right-wing extremism. But what I don't hope to see, and what I'm sometimes getting, at least in the Netherlands, is this idea that, like, okay, now jihadism has gone, right, with the defeat of IS, and now we have to focus all our efforts on right-wing extremism. It isn't one or the other. And I think, as you mentioned also, Victor, at the moment, I think in most countries, let's maybe keep a little bit more towards my own experience, at least in the Netherlands, the extremist prison population is overwhelmingly jihadist. So I don't think it's wrong to focus on radicalization among that particular contingent. But one thing I'd like to add in this debate about prison radicalization, so again, going back to this project we did where we spoke with lots of people involved in the reintegration process, these people are mainly concerned not what happens within prison, but outside of it. And one of their main concerns is, and this is probation service staff in the Netherlands who've had years of experience working with these extremist clients, as they call them, is that they can only themselves, out of a group of almost, 200, say that they have maybe de-radicalized 2. So I think a bigger issue perhaps is, does it make sense to talk about de-radicalization as a practical, one of the solutions that we may be able to use to increase societal safety? Because we're going to have hundreds of people released from prison in the coming years. And this is one of the tools we're using to mitigate the risk, but how effective is that really? So maybe that's also something we should be more focused on.
Well, that's actually a great transition to now. I'd like to move the discussion with you to the responses and how we deal with radicalization in prison. And perhaps, Eleni, turning to you first, how does it work in Greece? How do the Greek penitentiary services and security services try to monitor and contain radicalization in prison?
That's a very difficult question for us because we are in a transitional period at the moment. So we had, up to a few months ago, we had a government who was a leftist government who was more sympathetic towards what was happening in the prisons. So in the beginning, the whole plan was to have a separate prison where only the people convicted for terrorism would go. These are individuals who have long sentences, 17-year sentences and more. And they were moved to a prison in the center of Athens, Korydallos prison, where I found that all the connections were established. So in the past 4 to 5 years, we actually had a lot of these convicted people getting leaves. They got leaves from prison, even for individuals who had multiple life sentences attached to them. They were able to have a lot of more leniency, so they were able to go out in the society and establish networks. But in the past 2 months, we're seeing a huge shift in policy and in the efforts of the new government to, again, try to move towards a more rigid structure, a more rigid policy approach towards segregating the convicts of terrorism and the convicts for other crimes, basically.
And when you say separate, it means like put them in separate aisles or separate prisons?
No, physically separate them in different prisons. Yeah.
Okay. Now, of course, I mean, different countries have all different approaches, so it's hard to have an overview of all these different approaches. But Bart, could you perhaps explain to us how does it work in the Netherlands in terms of both, again, the monitoring and perhaps the role of not only the penitentiary administration but also of the intelligence services therein, and also in terms of containment?
Yeah, so in terms of monitoring, I think something very similar is going on, where it's a segregation. Well, that sounds really bad, right? Let's say a separation-based system where people are judged according to the degree of radicalization they might have. Again, to make sure that the most extremist cases don't come into contact with those who maybe still have some, let's say, some gray in their black and white worldview. In terms of monitoring, one of the key challenges here is that again, prison sentences aren't always that long. We also see this for returning foreign fighters due to evidentiary issues. And then they're handed over to probation services upon their provisional release from prison. But the means that the Dutch probation service has to monitor these individuals is really limited. Now, of course, intelligence agencies, police, they can do a bit more, but the numbers are getting so high that it's become a very practical challenge for all these agencies to sit around a table with each other and to, in a kind of anything near real-time basis, exchange relevant findings. So we've had a couple of painful cases where actually about a year ago, 6 people were arrested in the Netherlands who were, well, at least they are suspected of planning a major terrorist attack. And one of them, the ringleader, was actually someone that the probation services thought as an individual doing particularly well, right? And I'm not trying to make a point that probation services were naive or anything like that. I think, from my experience, these are some of the least naive people. You have to realize, during the course of their work, they meet their clients again and again and again and again. They are very used to the fact that most people who offend, whether it's terrorist or anything else, will within a very short period of time be at their office again, right? So these people, I don't think they have a very naive view of what they can accomplish. Yet they were still misled by someone who they were supposed to be monitoring. And I think this also indicates just how difficult it is for these agencies with, again, limited means to do this kind of monitoring to effectively assess the risk that people released on probation deserve. And I think that's one of the major issues that we need to tackle in the near future.
Victor, perhaps you want to add something?
I would just like to add that I think, just like what Bart said, and I just want to emphasize that it's very interesting what's happening after the prison release. Because if I just may put some numbers to it from our research, what we've seen in this 2015 sample from the 11 EU countries, ranging from, when we talk about jihadi, let's just say from UK all the way to Bulgaria, we've seen a few cases of reoffenders, people who've been in and out of prisons as criminals. There have been around 15 plus 4, so 19 people who were criminal reoffenders, and there were 19 plus 4, so 23 terrorist reoffenders, people who've been in prison for terrorism. Usually was a more low-key activity, I would say, spreading propaganda, for instance. And then they were arrested again in 2015. Usually it was there was a bit of an escalation or graduation, so that activity they were arrested for was either will or intent to travel, or they were already preparing an attack, or they were had a more organizational role, a supportive role. So we see people who are coming in and out of prisons, they offend again and again. Just like Bart said, we can see very short sentences for these people. So this can happen quite frequently. And just to emphasize this point as well, when it comes to releases, we've seen by 2023 we should have majority of our sample out. So I think we had 199 people who were arrested and convicted. Around 57% will be out by 2023, and actually half of those are already out. So now we're speaking already like at least 50, I think it's 45 actually, sorry, 45 people are already out of prison. And when we see this rate of recidivism, I think that's a bit of a worrying thing, especially because these people have experiences, these people are creating networks or circles or friendships or any kinds of relationships in prison. and also they come back as what we're trying to like emphasize, or I'm not saying that we're too worried about this, but what we like to talk about is these people might become also part of the narrative. Like they might have a narrative role, not just supporting role. These people come back as, you know, I've been in and out of prison, I know the system, I've been arrested there, I know this guy, etc., etc. So their status gets elevated in a sense. So this might be another, I think, threat or another thing that we should be at least looking at.
And just before arriving, I was quickly glancing through the report, and I think it's quite interesting to highlight the fact that your data in this report on recidivism indicates a much higher rate of recidivism than many other studies have shown in the past. I mean, sort of the traditional finding in this field was that recidivism rates for released terrorist convicts was very low, but generally 1 to 5%. But in your study, you have a rate of 19%, I think. And so perhaps I'd like to ask Bart, Eleni, whether you think there is something new with this wave of jihadi terrorists that may increase the rate of recidivism, or perhaps it's a lack of data, because we know it's very hard to get the data also in this field, that has resulted in this discrepancy of the results.
Yeah, I think it's actually one of those things where it is a data issue, and it is how to measure it. I think there's also some new research coming out quite soon. It does a much larger analysis of recidivism rates, not just in Europe, but I think specifically also in the US. And one of their main conclusions is the exact same thing, that recidivism rates appear to be much higher among terrorist offenders than what was maybe traditionally thought. I don't have the exact figure in my head, but it certainly isn't in the 5% range, but much closer to the 40 or 50. So is this a completely new thing, or are we just better able at measuring this? I'd go with the second, actually, but perhaps my colleagues have it.
I mean, again, I'm not going to speak about jihadi terrorism because ours is different, but I think it gives us a unique perspective in the personality of a person who chooses terrorism as an outlet of his violent tendencies. So in our case, we see that we have an individual who escaped prison, right? And he remained in society for a year. And during that year, he managed to perform, I think, 2 or 3 armed robberies. He was a member of November 17, the biggest terrorist organization in Greece. And then he left the prison. During the year that he was a fugitive, he was involved in the newest, biggest organization, which is the Fire Cells conspiracy. So I think he's a very, very good example of what a person who has the opportunity to leave prison, for example, and join society again, even as a fugitive, and he chooses not to. He chooses criminal activities, a very, very hard and severe crimes, not just a minor petty crime, but severe felony offenses. So I think that we should maybe investigate a little bit more on the personality of these individuals and seeing more individual characteristics and what actually are the triggering factors that makes these individuals choose terrorism, choose these violent offenses. Because I do not think it's just ideology. I think there is some underlying factor that leads these individuals to that outlet.
We are slowly but surely reaching the time where I will turn to the room and give them a chance to ask you questions. But before I do that, I'd like to give you, or to ask you, each one of you, a last question. I would like to ask each one of you to formulate one policy recommendation that you would really want to see on the agenda, and one recommendation for research, something that you feel should be done in the field of academia about this issue. Eleni, you want to go first?
Sure. Working within prisons, what I think is that we should, as a policy recommendation, I think that the boards granting parole or granting probation should be given more power to decide, to make more decisions and more recommendations towards the officials to revoke parole, to revoke probation. So that's one policy recommendation I can make. And as far as research, as I said before, I think that we should focus on the individual personality characteristics, even with hands-on interviews of these individuals and even more in-depth analysis of what makes them choose.
Thank you. Victor?
I suppose mine will sound a little bit harsh. I'm just trying to think about it economically as well. Because when we were talking about short sentences and reoffenders, and I understand that also monitoring a person and de-radicalizing or disengaging him at least after the prison is not easy, and when it comes to resources, then perhaps I would lean more towards longer prison sentences. And I think the model of the Netherlands and Greece is working when it comes to separation of these individuals.
Yeah, so as far as the policy recommendation goes, I think governments need to be much more willing to share the outcomes and exact setup of their own de-radicalization and reintegration, whatever you call them, programs. And I know this is going to be very difficult because often things will fail. So, for instance, in the Netherlands in the first year, 50% of everyone in this program tried to go to Syria, right? So, not a big success. But I mean, I think there's absolutely no point in keeping stuff like that secret. So only if we can learn from each other by really showing also the failures, can we hope to move this field a bit forward. Because I think if we don't dare to share this kind of stuff, then in 5 years' time, in 10 years' time, we'll be having the exact same conversations about whether or not these programs work, and maybe one country seems to be a bit more successful than the other. It would be a real shame if by that point in time we don't have some more hard data, for instance, based on recidivism rates, to assess the success of the multitude of these programs that have sprung up across Europe, across the world, really. That would, I think, would really be a shame. And in terms of a more academic, research-based recommendation, and maybe this is mostly speaking to myself and my colleagues, we've done a lot of stuff interviewing the personnel who run these reintegration programs, and we've really reached the limit of what we can achieve there. There is, as far as I know, only really one big study that looks at reintegration efforts, whether or not they're successful, by actually studying those they're targeted on. So actually interviewing and setting up tests for the extremists and the terrorists themselves. And again, this is extremely difficult to do because as researchers you really can't get to these people without government permission, approval, etc. And this raises all kinds of red flags and potential sensitivities. But again, I really emphasize that if we want to understand this better, and if you want to have a panel at some point where people can say, well, look, we don't just have to hypothesize, we have some real data, now that's the only way you're going to get it. So if anyone has any kind of influence in this regard, please think about using it for this goal. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Now I would like to turn to you and give each one of you a chance. I already see a hand. I don't know whether there are yes, there is a microphone there. There is a gentleman there, over there. If you can, sir, introduce yourself before asking the question, and if it's specific, please mention the name of the speaker, otherwise to the panel.
Sure. Good morning. I've got an observation and a question. My name's Ian Atchison, and in 2016, I led an independent review for the UK government of Islamist extremism in the UK prison probation system. So I come at this from a practitioner point of view, rather than from an academic point of view. I'm very interested in the discussion this morning, particularly the very worrying data you, by the way, surfaced on recidivism, which is something we look at far too little in this area, in my opinion. My observation is the value of the term de-radicalisation in the first place. I think it's become almost meaningless. What we were much more interested in relation to combating the phenomenon in UK prisons was separating de-radicalisation into desistance and disengagement. Desistance in those terms means what sort of security arrangements could be put in place through prison and beyond the prison gate to stop people who are ideologically motivated reoffending again. Disengagement, obviously, is a much more long-term goal where there's an authentic recanting from a terrorist mindset, which, of course, societally is extremely valuable. I think we need to be careful about the language and be much more sophisticated. People, generally speaking, aren't binary. They don't flip on and off between being radicalised and de-radicalised. It's often a journey. And one of the things we don't think works, and I speak as private citizen, I don't work for government, but I did have a background as a prison governor. I think that there's a certain amount of naivety about people suddenly recanting. What we've done is we've approached this topic often rather desperately, and we've put people through sheep-dip generic programs who are demonstrating radicalised views in custody. And they don't work, and often actually, and I don't know if it's the experience that you've seen as well, people who've been through the process, offenders, will boast about the fact that they've gamed the system because they understand what needs to be done to jump through the hoops. I think it's much more important to look at individuals and apply an individual programme to that person's criminogenic needs. It could be a psychological intervention, it could be a substance misuse intervention, a family needs intervention, or a combination of those and others that needs to be applied. It's incredibly expensive, but actually in terms of scale and lethality, in terms of the Islamist extremist threat, and I agree with Jeffrey's comments at the start, we must not become naive or complacent about this. It is definitely worth doing because of the consequences of letting these people slip through the gap. Sorry about that long observation, but you've prompted it. The second question is that I made 69 recommendations in relation to the government independent review that I led, 68 of which were adopted. One of the most controversial ones was the idea of separation, going back to the Dutch model, Bard, which I know that you're very familiar with, and I've been to Vught and met Eula Wanders and visited the unit of Vught, and I was extremely impressed by it. In fact, it was one of the reasons I suggested that there ought to be separation units in the UK prison system, and in fact there are now. And you probably can tell from my accent, I'm from Northern Ireland, and there was a lot of controversy about this idea because of the historic connotations of separation at the Maze prison and McGabry prison in Northern Ireland, which are specious comparisons, frankly. But in any case, my rambling question is, you haven't talked about the difference between the different models to any great extent of separation and integration and hybrid models in between that operate across Europe. Did you arrive at any kind of consensus about what was the best issue? From my point of view, it was a question of what is the least bad, or the least worst option for separating the most ideologically inspired and highly subversive offenders, not all terrorist prisoners, I hasten to add, but of those, the smaller subset who are intent in proselytizing their hateful ideologies to others.
Thank you for the question. Whoever wants to address it, Bart, perhaps starting because the Dutch model was
exactly.
pointed out.
Pick up on a couple of things there. So we didn't actually look at the way in which these prisons organize their, let's say, terrorism wing across Europe. So it's really focused only on the Netherlands. So it's unfortunately hard for me to speak to that particular question. But one thing I'd just like to emphasize, and I completely agree with you what you were mentioning, right? This distinction between disengagement, de-radicalization, etc. It's also why I mentioned that the Dutch probation service staff, after years of work, can only give, in their estimation, 2 examples of people who have been de-radicalized. And it certainly also goes to the point I want to make, which is that they don't focus on this as their primary objective. So they, I think, take a very nuanced approach in which they recognize that getting someone to completely change their minds about a very personal, very important worldview they hold is nigh on impossible in most cases. So instead they try and go for much more practical approaches intended to kind of wean people away from this extremist milieu in which they are in and from the behavior that can lead to the use of or the indirect support of violence. So it's much more about disengagement, I would say, than about de-radicalization. But I think the public debate is often still very much in terms of can we, should we, and how can we make people de-radicalize as quickly as possible. And I agree that that's, I don't think, a very helpful way of going about these things. So yeah, there's a lot of debate to be had there, and I think one of the things we could do is to use different terminology, but that's often the case in terrorism studies that the words we're stuck with aren't ideal, but it's hard to change them.
Eleni?
I mean, thank you for touching on the need of having specialized personnel in prisons. I usually find when I go to prisons that the people who are inside, they will contact the social services and the psychologists when they need something. They will not usually contact them to be involved in the program. either a substance abuse program or a de-radicalization program. So we have to understand what the needs of the prisoners are when they will come to contact with the specific staff. So I think for any sort of de-radicalization effort to be successful is to further understand the needs of these prisoners. Why would they come in contact with the personnel? So I think more research needs to be done towards that aspect. Speaking from the Greek perspective, when they tried to do the segregation, it was with mixed results. We saw that there were the criminals were put in the terrorists, actually the convicted terrorists that were put in Domokos prison, which was specialized for the terrorist offenders, became more violent, and we saw that they were more acting against the prison guards. So there are some considerations to be taken into that aspect. But if we are to have segregation or separation of offenses, not individuals, I would advocate for separation of offenses. If we have specific institutions for people who commit sex offenses, then we can have a specific institution for people who are convicted for a terrorism offense in that general aspect, I think.
Victor, if you don't mind, I mean, perhaps we can, or you want to add something? Because, I mean, time is running. Perhaps I'd just like to give a chance again to take at least one or two more questions, if there is any. So please raise your hand. I'm sure you're all burning with questions. Just shy. Yes, sir.
Yeah, Mark Burley from AFP. It strikes me from this conversation that you're saying that de-radicalization isn't going to work, that these guys aren't going to change their ways. We have to touch eventually on the idea of liberal values in prison or not. Maybe you can talk a little bit of, are these guys forfeiting their rights? What's going on?
Victor, you want to jump in first?
I think you're right in saying that. We haven't been looking that much, I mean, our research hasn't been looking that much into what actually goes on in the prisons per se. So we didn't have the access, unfortunately, like us, I mean, I'm speaking from GLOBSEC perspective, not from our partners who've been doing the research, to see how these people behave. And we haven't had the luck, I think, or the opportunity to really conduct any interviews or any such to do any such qualitative research. But it would be interesting to see what their opinions would be. And I think, am I right in saying that Eleni has done a few interviews? So I'll just rather give it to the expert here.
I can speak again from the Greek perspective, which is different because our convicts are very vocal. So in terms of, again, when I made the recommendation that we have to understand the needs of the prisoners, it's because of what is our understanding already. We have people who are convicted in prisons who have published books on their experience with terrorism. Dimitris Koufodinas is a best-selling author. He has published 2 books while in prison. So I think his civil liberties are taken care of, untouched. And also, a very interesting thing that he has been convicted for 17 assassinations, and he has not taken the blame. He has taken the blame for every single one of them, but he does not feel remorseful for any of them. And that's something we have to look into. And I'm taking like an individual who has been very vocal about it, and he has published 2 books on it. So I understand your concern of their civil liberties, and that's why I'm saying that the specialized personnel within prison that will cater to the needs of these individuals, not something that it will be forced on them, but when they approach the staff of the prisons. So I think that that's the key.
Could I just add something? So I'm not quite sure I understand your civil liberties question, whether they forfeited them or something like that. But your bigger question, does this work? Is this worth spending any money on? Right. I think that's a key question, and I'm actually, so despite all the criticism I think I've been giving, I'm quite in favor of having these, let's call them reintegration programs. But I think we need to be very realistic. This isn't because we want to do favors to convicted terrorists or extremists, right? So because I think it can be sold like that sometimes. This is one of the ways, not the only way, one of the tools we have in our counterterrorism toolbox to ensure, within all kinds of constraints, or to minimize the chances that these people will recidivize after release from prison. And yes, all kinds of things will go wrong, as they do with other forms of offending. This isn't just specific to the terrorist problem. I think in the Netherlands, about 50% of people who are in prison for any kind of offense are in touch with the Justice Department again within 2 years or so, right? So recidivism is simply a fact of life, and it will be here as well. So don't see this as the solution to this issue. See it as one of the things that we can do and have realistic expectations. And while de-radicalization as such may not be very likely, even though it might be desirable in a theoretical sense, think about it in terms of disengagement, trying to get them to, maybe they can hold on to their radical views as disagreeable as we may find them, but a lower baseline for reintegration success would be if they no longer act on those views. And in that sense, at least the Dutch program has so far been markedly more successful. Will that hold over 5 or 10 years? That's something we don't know yet, but that's the way I would approach this, not simply as something intended to change someone's mind.
Thank you very much. I see one last question. I'll take it as the last question, if you can make it short.
Yeah, Thomas, perfect. Just an observation from my part. It's Gert Schouten, Belgian Coordination Unit for Threat Analysis. And I would like to plead for the continuing use of the word of de-radicalization. It does exist. And we have tracked a lot of people who came back from Syria and Iraq in prison, outside prison, who have failed to travel to the region, but who are radicalized, who missed. Quite a lot of them. Sorry, I think the micro has some issues. Quite a lot of them have completely de-radicalized. In most cases, they did it themselves, and because they saw what life on the IS was, or they became disillusioned, and so on, and they have completely changed their cloak, and they have changed their life. They do not want to be part of that scene anymore, and they have taken a new new ways in their lives. And we have to keep track of those people, and we have to also give them the right to sort of put a stamp on them. Okay, they have been de-radicalized. All signals are clear, and in that sense, I think the term de-radicalization can still have a lot of use. I do agree that in prison, and it's very difficult to speak of complete de-radicalization because it is such an artificial environment, and you will have to wait what happens with the person when he comes out. Was it genuine or not? That's something you can only judge afterwards. And in these circumstances, yes, perhaps it's better to talk about disengagement signals and whatever. But in real life, we do see people who have been completely de-radicalized, and I think we should also, they deserve to be seen as such, because they have made a lot of efforts for that. And it's not necessarily, and that's another part of the story, but I will not dwell on that. It's not necessarily because of the programs that we put into it, or because of the radicalization trajectories, etc., etc. Quite often it is just a coincidence of personal circumstances, getting married, family that does its best to reintegrate them, etc., and etc. There's a lot of issues that play a role there. But it does happen quite a lot.
Thank you very much, Gert. And actually, I think in your observation, the 2 points that I thought was quite interesting. One is de-radicalization or disengagement often occurs without these programs that we have developed over the past few years, which is something that should make us slightly reflect perhaps on those programs. And the other thing is also, I mean, de-radicalization, it's also a matter of degree. It's not, I mean, I think in the case of the probation, they said like only 2 cases of successful de-radicalization as people really being what we would call like moderate Muslims, I assume. But I guess in between there is a wide spectrum of things that we might find more tolerable in our societies, even though not being fully moderate. A lot of us are not moderate in any way anyway. So unless you want to add anything on this last observation, which was more an observation than a question.
And just general agreement, I think the last point was very interesting, that people quit or disengage, whatever you want to call it, often on their own accord, and often for very interesting and human reasons, one of them being they can't stand their former group mates anymore and just want something else. So they want a life outside the group, they want to marry, they want to have kids, they want a different career. So I think that's a key point to make.
And again, the need for research on individual personality characteristic, and we need to get the funding, us researchers need to get the funding to do that, to understand them better.
I also absolutely agree. I think it's we need to take a very individualistic approach, and I think we also need to be looking at people who were just disillusioned from the promise that they, I think, believed, but they came out disappointed. So I think those are also very important demographic group to be looking at.
Well, this concludes the panel. Thank you very much to all of you. Thank you very much to the panelists. Please join me in a round of applause to thank them.